Merry Christmas and welcome to winter, Brad. I just don't want you to feel out of season here with the temperatures.
What are you saying, Tom?
Brr, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Hey, this ain't nothing compared to winter, Tom.
I don't know. I think it was the same. Yesterday I went on, I thought I was going to say a walk, but it turned out to be a death march in the, whatever it was, 42-degree weather, a little drizzly and windy. I was almost walking backwards, but unintentionally. That's how crappy it was yesterday. But it's supposed to be nicer here for this Memorial Day weekend.
We're talking about living up in the North Woods, folks.
Yes. Hey, we're going to start the show. That red light's on again.
Hit it.
Here we go.
Get ready to free your minds, advance freedom, and better all of society with the Annoying Peasants.
And now for something completely different.
Humans do have an amazing capacity for believing what they choose. I think before we go around killing people, we had better make damn sure of our evidence.
They lied to you. It's time to learn the truth.
You can't handle the truth!
From what was once an inarticulate mass of lifeless tissues, may I now present a cultured, sophisticated man about town.
That was one of the older intros, you know, the one that ended up with the cultured, sophisticated man about town. And theoretically, that's us, Brad.
Well, of course, Tom.
Well, we start the Annoying Peasant radio show with a lie, right? That's how we do it?
Well, we are all of those things. And we're, are we not, Tom, really whatever we want to be?
Exactly. This is fantasy land.
Yeah, fairy dust.
Yes.
Hey, welcome everybody to this episode of the Annoying Peasant Radio Show. My name is Brad, and I'm joined by my good friend Tom. Hi, Tom.
Hello, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Tonight's episode is entitled "Why? 5 Reasons Why I'm Not an Anarchist," and that it. So
why? Yeah, it's why that's an incoherent statement.
Why it's an incoherent statement. So this is we're doing something a little different tonight. This is part 1 of a 5-part sort of a series, contiguous episodes that we're going to be talking about this, and we're going to get into who wrote this, and Tom's got some great commentary to talk about. He's kind of going in the face of what we're here to talk about. Tom is a self-proclaimed anarchist. Archno-capitalist, are you not, Tom?
Anarcho-capitalist.
Anarcho-capitalist.
Yeah, I've now this fella here used the word anarchist. I've stayed away. I typically like to stay away from the word anarchist. I like to stay even away from libertarian. I'm just saying I'm a supporter of the freedom philosophy, just because I think people get freaked out by those words.
I was going to say, we've just scared a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
When we've mentioned anarchists and that we live in the North Woods, and I think that they're thinking we're in camouflage and polishing our guns.
Yeah. So, I think those words are so widely misunderstood and that's really my reasoning. You could, I don't know, argue maybe that's just marketing.
No, but anarchists, again, I think we talk a lot about our indoctrination, and I think if you ask many people what an anarchist was, whether it was, I think they would draw a negative correlation to it, maybe even potentially drawing a conclusion that we're violent dudes and whatever else. I don't know what all they'd think. I'd be very curious to think, but I think a lot of people would certainly step back when we say the word anarchist.
Yeah, I would say outside of our conversations and in, I don't know, this is not the right, but this freedom community that, I don't know, I'm in conversations with, outside of that, I would say almost 100% of the time that I hear the word anarchist, it's, usually in the context of, I don't know, some kids throwing bottles and Molotov cocktails, overturning cars, and all this kind of stuff. Violence, basically. So, I don't, begrudge anybody for having that understanding of the word, because it's...
And if I'm being honest, when you've posed that description to me, I went, wow, what the heck is this all about?
Right. Because it does sound crazy.
Yep.
And that's not what I would argue is the proper use of the word, but it's maybe the common use of the word, and then you can argue that makes it the proper use of the word.
So if we haven't scared you to turn us off yet, I dare you to listen a little bit longer, because we think we're a couple of reasonable guys that like to have civil dialogue about actually kind of making our world a better place.
Yeah. It's really arguably, one of the labels that's been put on this is the philosophy of peace, which I commonly associate with the opposite of violence or opposed to violence. And I think that's kind of a good thing. So, well, absolutely. I'll move on quick. I like to just give a very short, big picture photo, a snapshot on this show. I support that everyone should be free to pursue his or her own life interest, provided that pursuit is a peaceful one, consistent with what we've just been talking about. I would say it is unjust to initiate force against another. Most are untroubled at this point with the thought, but to determine if force is being initiated against another, property rights must be established. I would argue the only universal ethic which establishes property rights is that of self-ownership. For if you do not own yourself, it is difficult to conceive of how you could own anything at all. I would just want to add to that a little bit. I would say people who pursue this philosophy some are called, might use the label maniacal in the application of this. And that's where I would caution people to be careful. I would argue that I think essentially stealing is unjust, and it doesn't matter who does it or what organizations do it. Stealing is stealing, and it is unjust. And that's my little caution to people to really look at this. When stealing is done by a third party, a lot of people don't object to it. That's why I think we do some of that analysis on this show to indicate to people that, hey, this is actually an example of stealing, and this is one of the reasons, at least certainly me, have an objection to the existence of the state. And again, that sounds pretty radical to a lot of people, but I think if you stay with us and learn some of the context and understand it, I think you can come around. So,
and I don't think it's a big reach. We've been a while since we talked about this, and we need to move on, but I don't think it's a big reach for people to sit and whether they might buy into how we describe ourselves or whatever else, probably not. We don't expect that. But I think what we would challenge people on is, hey, how do you think this thing with our government and our country as a whole feels to you? How do you feel like you're treated fairly in it? Do you feel like you have a say in it? Do you feel like it's you're able, just like Tom said, to pursue your life interests without being encumbered?
There you go.
All right.
So as Brad alluded to earlier, in this specific episode of the show, we're going to look at the first of 5 objections to anarchy. There's that bad word. Authored by a fellow by the name of Austin Peterson. We'll give you more of these details in a little bit. It was found in the Libertarian Republic, thelibertarianrepublic.com. The official title was 5 Reasons Why I'm Not an Anarchist. I will argue that Mr. Peterson has made an incoherent statement. In other words, he made errors. I will attempt to refute his objections to freedom point by point, essentially. And I would just caution everybody or ask people to really consider the underpinnings of freedom carefully as we make the case against Mr. Peterson's statement. I think that kind of gives you basically what we're going to talk about by and large. So,
okay.
Have at her.
Let's do some announcements. Thanks to our good friend Nick Ludwig from hanging with us last week. Great dude, always interesting. And he was joining us to talk about AgriFest 2015 at the Villa Marie Conference Center and retreat September 24th to 27th up in, what's the name of the town in
Frontenac.
Frontenac, Minnesota. So save that date. If you can find a way to get there, we encourage it because it's a bunch of quality, big thinking folks.
Yeah.
And a very good time. So check that out. I'm sure we'll be talking about that as it gets closer and maybe have Nick back on. But thanks to Nick for that.
Yes. And he did some funnies. We had some fun last week, too. He made us laugh.
As we would expect.
Yeah.
The other thing that we're always promoting is to watch this, watch Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? Episode 12. And it's debate same-sex marriage from Harvard Business School, Michael Sandel. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about Michael Sandel in a little while. But it's some good, again, thought-provoking lecture series that he puts on.
Yeah.
Comment to that, Tom?
Yeah, very cool.
Okay. We'll be doing another show live next Tuesday, May 26th at 7 p.m. Central Time, as we do most weeks. The topic is the notion of representative government, and our good friend, the Northwoods Mom, will be joining us again. We look forward to another great conversation with her. She's always great and a good friend of ours. So that's next Tuesday, May 26th at 7 p.m. Central, if you'd like to listen to us live. The chat room is open.
And Tim is in there.
And, pardon me?
Tim is in there, and he's probably lonely, so somebody else get in there with him.
Thanks for joining us, Tim. You were awesome. Love engaging with you on Facebook. Thanks very much.
Yeah, he had a lot of good conversations in this last week or two.
I loved the one. Are we going to talk about that, Tom?
We didn't have it on the docket, but it was about basically capital punishment.
Yep.
Right. And I think it was influenced, obviously, or initiated by the Tsarnaev verdict. Right, the younger guy who was the Boston bombing, Boston Marathon bomber.
Yep.
So interesting debate on there. If you have curiosity, find Tim's page, or it actually came. I can't remember if it comes to me or if it comes to Annoying Peasant Radio feed. But you can find it on there. Texas Father 7. Check it out.
And as always, I'm a big proponent and fan of civil dialogue. I think that if our populace and we weren't so he said, she said, and divided right now, we'd get a lot farther whenever you have civil dialogue. As a business person, you wouldn't get anything done if you didn't have civil dialogue. And so I just thought what I tuned into, I think I even made a comment to or once or twice. It was a great civil dialogue that he had going on there with a lot of different perspectives, and well done.
Yes, no doubt.
So we have a quote of the day, and that is, the duty of a true patriot is to protect his country from its government. And that's by Thomas Paine.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one for a lot of people. I mean, I shouldn't say that one particular, but a lot of them are difficult that we do for quotes of the day. And, of course, I do that in part to get people to go, huh?
Right.
But it's a little tough.
Well, so many people correlate the validity of this country by our government.
Yes, they kind of see them as one and the same. The country is the government.
Right.
And I'm here to say my view is that it's clearly not.
It's the people.
The government is one thing. The rest of us is another thing. Yeah. We are not them. Them are not us.
Wow, you talk good.
Thank you. I always like a compliment.
So some news items. We're going to talk about just briefly the Amtrak derailment and accident.
Yep.
So you've got a couple good comments here. One, only the state is a failure success, and a success is failure. Monopoly works like this. Why don't you elaborate, Tom?
Yeah, think about this, and I guess we're going to get to, I'll wind up jumping ahead. Actually, this again comes via Tim again, and he just had this on, or at least I just saw it a little bit ago, and this is an additional quote today, but I think it's apropos because this gets to what you just asked me to comment on.
No, I didn't read that very well. Let me try that again if I could.
Yep.
Only with the state is a failure success, and a success is failure.
Yes. And I argue monopoly works that way. That's, primarily that's, the trouble with monopoly. That's why people, I don't know, if I start selling rubber bands and I get everyone out of the market, and it's not really the definition of monopoly. It's being barred legally from competing with me. But that's the whole deal, that I can basically abuse people by that whole term. Failure is success and success is failure.
And so I know what you mean by that, but what do you mean by that, Tom?
Well, let me read the Ayn Rand quote that Tim had up to contrast that first, and then we'll go deeper. He said, Rand says, a businessman cannot force you to buy his product. If he makes a mistake, he suffers the consequences. If he fails, he takes the loss. A bureaucrat forces you to obey his decisions, whether you agree with him or not. If he makes a mistake, you suffer the consequences. If he fails, he passes the loss on to you in the form of heavier taxes. And that was from Ayn Rand, and I thank Tim for that because I just saw that here prior to this show, and I thought, that fits what we're talking about on a number of levels tonight. So, again, in this case, just think about if this was Amtrak was a truly private venture, and before this, they knew they had some safety issues, and they basically came back. This private company said, yes, we get it. We have safety issues, but we simply don't have the budget to address them. And if this wreck would happen, I would argue, unless they were in with the cronies, in with the state, they were in bed with them. If they were pals with them, then all bets are off. But if it was truly a free market, they would be held accountable for that. You can't just say, well, we didn't have funding, so, hey, sorry, whatever. I don't know can't remember how many people died from that. You just go, hey, there was no money in the budget to save you, so it happens, right? If a private firm did that, if Boeing did that, well, and Boeing's largely in bed with the state too. The problem is there's not many good free market examples anymore. They would be fully held accountable for what they did. And just saying, hey, there's not money in our budget to do it, wouldn't make that excusable, right? It would either be, hey, you got to limit your service. And in this case, if you knew that track or that section of tracks, you either have to bypass it or you cannot use it. So your run, I don't even know exactly where the run was, from New York to D.C. is out. It's out of service. You can't do it because it's unsafe, right? But in this case, they apparently had these discussions sometime prior to the wreck. They decided they didn't have the money, so they decided to run the trains anyways. They have this wreck. Innocent people are injured and killed. And here's the deal. You say, well, these people are still, their families are going to be compensated. I would argue, well, you could never fully compensate for any of this stuff, whether it's an injury or a death. I mean, what good does money do you? It doesn't bring that person back. It's impossible. But even so, the money's being paid to these people is not from these bureaucrats. It's taxation that came from you and me, who had no say in how this train system is going to operate. I mean, I don't remember anybody calling me and asking me, and even saying, hey, your recommendations will be binding. In other words, we'll do them. And by the way, if they're wrong, you'll be accountable for it. None of that ever happens. I'm just responsible in some part to provide additional funding to pay out for the miscreants, what they do. And I think that's in direct contrast to the quote that Ayn Rand, we just read from Ayn Rand. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the trouble with it. The fellas, the people who make these decisions don't suffer the consequences for bad ones. They also, on the other side, don't really get upside for the good ones. If they're really good businessmen, they get out of that and they go into business and they say, hey, I know how to make really good decisions. There'll be huge upside to what I recommend or what I try to do operationally, so I'm going to reap the benefits. I'm going to go into business and get that.
So are you alluding that they're being malicious?
I don't know any one of these individuals personally, and I have not seen a full analysis of what the decisions were, so I can't say that. But what I can say is the system is fundamentally flawed. It provides, this one's for Tanya, perverse incentives. And that's why you cannot expect this to work properly or well or whatever word you want to use with that. Because they don't have the incentive to make things better ahead of time. They, now they can. A lot of the politicians can rush in and say, "Well, let's allocate more money for Amtrak," and they're going to look like heroes now. Most people are going to say, "Yeah, that's great. See, there was a bad thing, and they're fixing it. That's nice. They're wonderful fellas." But what about before the people were killed? I think it would have been a little more appropriate to do it then, or again, to not use that track because it's got to go out of service because it's not safe.
Okay, I'm going to challenge you another way, and then we
Sure.
got to keep moving on. We always talk about the free market. We always talk about living in a stateless society. Contrast that for me. So if this was a private train line,
Yes.
you were talking the other night. You and I were talking last night, I believe, that said, we talk about roads. We talk about railroads, Amtrak, government entity, roads built by our government, that sort of thing. That's what a lot of us identify with as a service that our government provides. So if the government wasn't there to provide that, and probably a private entity would step up to do that if it was a profitable endeavor. Correct?
Yes. Again, since we've been on the path to statism for, I would argue, since the beginning of the existence of the country, we could be living in a Jetsons world for all we know if all these malinvestments weren't made. And it's a whole long description there, the malinvestments. But whenever the state interferes with the marketplace, in other words, what I'm saying is maybe, how did George Jetson get around his little, I don't know what you call that, little car spacecraft he had? I mean, maybe that would be the mode of transportation. Maybe it would be air travel as we know it today, but it would maybe be more efficient because there'd be a higher demand for it because maybe rail wouldn't have developed. Maybe it would largely be rail and very little on air travel. Maybe the roadways would be better performing because of the proper incentives would be in place to make the roadways more efficient, right? If I own the road, I would like to have the highest possible speed limit on my road because I want to get you on my road, but I want to get you off because I want to get the next guy on. So maybe I'd be innovative in ways. I don't know. I'd have a single lane that the minimum speed limit is 100 miles an hour. The maximum is like 105, right? So basically everybody's going the same speed. There's talk to Walter Block, who's written books on roads. All these other possibilities, they all seem crazy to people when I say them. Yeah, well, you don't know that would happen. Yes, of course I don't know that would happen. I don't know what the iPhone 12 is going to be able to do either. But people don't freak out about that. But they'd freak out about if we propose a peaceful society and they're not assured the same crappy level of service in 20 years that they're getting now from roads, Amtrak, and all the other government-run crap.
Okay, so going back to this, in a free society, this would be a commercial entity, a private entity that would be running, this track.
Right.
And what would happen, Tom, if such a disaster occurred?
If it was severe enough, they would bear the consequence of their poor decision, I would argue, post accident. I can tell you it was a poor decision. I may not have been able to tell you beforehand. I mean, I'm not a genius, but I'm saying, hey, they obviously made a mistake, and they would bear the burden of making such mistakes. In other words, they would lose future revenue. People wouldn't go on there. They would lose their reputation. They may potentially be put out of business, bankrupt, done, depending, again, on how severe the recourse was against them by the surviving members of those families that were injured and killed. Where that's obviously not the case. I don't hear anybody going, Amtrak's going out, they're done. They get more money. That does not happen in a free society.
Which goes back to your first comment that with the state,
exactly,
is a failure success and a success a failure.
Exactly. Right? The best thing you can do if you're in with the state is screw up, because that gets you more money. Because you go, see, we didn't have enough money, so we need more money. Well, it doesn't work that way if you're an independently operating business. If you screw up, you pay the consequences for it. And a lot of times you wind up with a lot less money because of that. So you do things ahead of time to avoid such losses. What's their incentive to avoid such losses? They don't pay the losses. You and I do as taxpayers. So,
okay.
Dead horse, beaten. Next item.
All right. What is that, the Lindsey Graham comment?
Yeah. You know,
he's announced that he will likely run for the White House.
No, my favorite is he announced that he will likely announce.
That's right.
I don't know this. I guess people are just so full of themselves and funny. But so I had two things there. The ridiculous quotes by Lindsey Graham. I thought that was a little interesting. Just so people a little bit understand what they're getting into. And I'm going to go over these. This was from Julie Borowski's site. She's a lot more famous than we are. And she's I think she's more of a minarchist, maybe self-described. If I did that incorrectly, I apologize to her. I'd let her describe herself, but she's not here to do that.
Okay.
But just, she has like 10 of his quotes, and she calls them, I think, 10 ridiculous quotes by Lindsey Graham. One was on, I guess it was either on or from CBS News. The first one, he says on his intention to run for president, I'm running because I think the world is falling apart. That might be a bit alarmist in my view. And don't underestimate fear tactics in getting people to do things. Mm-hmm. 2, on Syria, he says the world is literally about to blow up, and our president did not really paint a fair picture of the threats we face. And that came from the Huntington Post. He was for TARP. That was the, $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program. That's the short version is TARP. And basically the bank bailouts, what was that, 2008, somewhere in there. And he was afraid that the whole thing was going to be a financial meltdown. So he basically supports too big to fail. Mm-hmm. So once you that's a good thing if you're a company. You get really big. It doesn't matter what kind you basically become pseudo-state, because if you fail, they give you more money. This, my personal favorite, was number 4. Free speech is a great idea, but we're in a war. And so I guess you just can revoke if you rely on the state to provide you your rights. Of course, they can take them back. They can whenever they want. So I'm not a believer that my rights come from the state. So I don't believe they're in a position to revoke my rights under any circumstances. 5 was we live in the most dangerous times imaginable. Again, I think I'd call that a scare tactic. On Iran, this is another good one. We're walking down the road to Armageddon. We have about 18 months using the international community to decisively act, right? Because the idea is, hey, after 18 months, Iran's going to have the bomb, and now we got a bigger problem. By the way, the date of that comment was September 2009. I don't know how many years I've been hearing that Iran's going to have the bomb, and that's a whole nother show unto itself about Iran, the bomb, or anybody else in the bomb, blah, blah, blah. But I would, again, fear tactic is where I'd broadly put that under. Number 7, I only have a few more. When asked how long U.S. troops need to stay in Iraq in 2003, he said, perhaps a year or more. If we're there through 2009, something went wrong. Well, I'm going to say something went wrong. And I think these learned peoples who are our leaders, our dear leaders, I thought they were supposed to be kind of smart and know what's going on. Number 8, Edward Snowden. I hope we chase him to the ends of the earth. Here's the guy who exposed that the government is violating the constitutional rights of every single American. I thought treason was, and he didn't say treason here. This is me kind of but he's commonly seen as well. I think what he did was a treasonous act. Isn't treason divulging information to your enemy for aiding them against you? Well, if he divulges information to the American public, I guess the state sees us as the enemy because he divulged it to us. And I know the detractors say, well, the enemies, the bad guys heard it too. Okay, I get it. If I'm president of the United States, this is number 9, if I'm president of the United States and you're thinking about joining Al-Qaeda or ISIS or ISIL or IS or whatever you want to call it now, I'm not going to call a judge. I'm going to call a drone and we will kill you. That's a quote. And the last one is when they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up. You don't get a lawyer. And that's when I think he's talking about the guys in Gitmo, essentially. This is a guy that's, potentially presidential candidate because he's announced that he might announce. But, potentially long-term, this guy could be a president in whatever it is, 1.5 2 years. Think about that.
So, listening to these comments, I got to say that maybe his are a little bit more extreme, but I think that they're everyday rhetoric by our current politicians.
Yeah, it's really not that extreme to thinking, at least in those veins. Right? Maybe you could take issue with how he said it or something, but, really that's where we are.
Right.
Scare tactics for the people. Killing people without a trial. And I know people say, well, they're enemy combatants. I would argue, yes, because they came up with that new category because they're not soldiers, because soldiers had to be uniformed, and largely they're not. And as a whole, that's 10 shows of discussion there.
Yeah, but so here's a point I would make is that as you sit and hear the news and you read this, however you get your news source, and you hear comments like this, I think one of the first steps is to stand back and go, okay, what's beyond what's just a reality of this is what is a comment or comments like this? What does it serve? Who does it serve? And it serves, in this case, it serves probably Mr. Graham and his political cronies to be able to stir the pot and do more, make bigger government. Would you agree, Tom?
Yes. Make no mistake. Lindsey Graham is a politician, and a politician will, in my experience, will darn near do anything. And that means if the marketing guys in his team say, hey, you need to comb your hair, put the part on the other side, that's what you do to get more votes. If they say, hey, you'll get more voters if you do that, right? They'll basically do or say anything to get the votes, which I would argue, doesn't that indicate that these people essentially are psychopaths, willing to essentially do anything to gain the authority over you? In other words, I think you have to pass the precondition. You basically need to be a psychopath to do it.
I think a lot of people would find that to be extreme, but you have to, let's back it down a little bit, and that says that by saying, in my opinion, that the very machine that they are a part of, they are completely dedicated to maintaining.
Absolutely, and growing.
Right.
And because it serves their personal interests. And
authority and power.
Yes, and I wouldn't argue with people to pursue their best interests. I don't have any problem with that. Again, if the state didn't exist, they wouldn't be able to pursue those interests, though. In other words, if that mechanism wasn't there, sure, you can say, I want to dominate the world. I want to have authority over it, but there's no machine of authority. So good luck with that. I mean, the way you're left with is you're going to have to educate and persuade people to follow you. I got no problem with that because that's not a coercive relationship.
Right.
But that's not what they're doing, and that's not what they're proposing to continue to do.
Okay.
So
Where do you say we move on?
we're going to move on. We're going to talk about this. Oh, actually, before we get to, I wanted, where did I? Okay, just since we brought up Lindsey Graham, there was an article from the Wall Street Journal. I'm just going to do this very quickly. You could check it out. It's entitled, "Who's Running for President in 2016?" And I just wanted to run through it quick just so people kind of have a snapshot of where we are today. Jeb Bush is a likely. He's not announced.
He's going to announce it. He's going to announce.
Yeah. He's Ben Carson, who we talked about on the show, he's actually announced. Right? Chris Christie is a likely. He hasn't, to my understanding, he has not formally announced as of what are we, May 19th, 2015 is where we are. Ted Cruz has, in fact, announced. Carly Fiorina, the former HP CEO gal, she's announced. And I'm not entirely a former governor of Virginia, Jim Gilmore, he's a maybe. Lindsey Graham, in this article, they're calling him a likely. Mike Huckabee has announced, the former Fox News talk show guy and governor from Arkansas. Bobby Jindal, who's a former governor of Louisiana. I think former, maybe he's current. I can't remember, but associated with the governor of Louisiana. He's a likely. He's not announced. And then I think we're switching gears to there's Rand Paul's come up. George Pataki, he's a maybe. He's a former governor of New York. And then Rand Paul, of course, he's already announced. He's in. And I think the last Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, he's a likely. They put him here. Marco Rubio, he's a senator from Florida. He's announced. And Rick Santorum, who ran last time, he's from Pennsylvania, former senator, I believe. He's a likely. Oh, I would have forgot. Scott Walker is also a likely. Then I think these are all Democrats. Joe Biden is a maybe. Accordingly, the vice president. Lincoln Chafee, actually, he's a Republican, if I remember right. And Hillary Clinton. Martin O'Malley, everybody knows Hillary, so I'm not going to go. Martin O'Malley, he is, I think, former, maybe current governor of Maryland. He's a likely. I don't know if I said that. Jim Webb is a likely. One term in the U.S. Senate from Virginia. And Bernie Sanders, we talked about him, I don't know, a show or two or three ago. He's actually announced. So that's kind of the snapshot of where we are right now on that front. So I just thought that was a little interesting. Those are your choices, folks. At least theoretically, they're going to be your choices. So I thought that's why those quotes from Lindsey Graham were. Look at what you're considering or you'd be contemplating.
Too bad there's only one job, right?
Yeah. Okay. We kill that. We want to do. Okay. So this fella, and this is, I guess, the feature of a story for tonight, and I guess we should remind everybody you're listening to the Annoying Peasant Radio Show, and we're very happy that you joined us. We're going to go through this fella. His name is Austin Peterson, if I got that right. He wrote a story that's found in the Libertarian Republic, which is the libertarianrepublic.com. It's entitled 5 Reasons Why I'm Not an Anarchist, and we already talked about why I don't use that word, and he's got 5 of them, and we're just going to do kind of point by point here on his first reason of why he's not an anarchist. So I went through this earlier, and I thought, if you want to read it, it'd be very. Actually, I think I'll read it in its entirely. It's only a couple.
It's not pages and pages. It's a couple paragraphs. And
right.
I think that for the sake of this discussion, we're not being fair to folks that haven't read it,
right?
Unless we share it. So you can or I can.
Go for it, Brad. You read it.
Okay, so as point number 1 is a right is something that must be provided. Any society aimed at protecting natural rights must use some type of force to guarantee those rights. Any mechanism of force used to guarantee those rights have the same effect as government, no matter what that form may take. If there's a natural right to a lawyer, if you are accused of a crime, then that right means that there must be resources expended to provide citizens with a defense against the government's accusations. A fully privatized law system must be justice. I'm sorry, a fully privatized law system would be justice for sale to the highest bidder. Citizens without the means to defend themselves could be railroaded into arbitration that works against their interest and for whoever paid for the judge. For that reason, the Constitution laid out the means for citizens to be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures, cruel or unusual punishment, or from things like double jeopardy. It means that while citizens have the right to defend themselves, they must also be defended if they are too weak to defend themselves. Members of the Arizona militia don't worry about home invasions, but 90-year-old grandmothers in Massachusetts might. Competitive policy and private security would be available, but public security for those who can't protect themselves is a natural right if the aim of society is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A virtuous society would also hopefully include the unborn in that definition.
Okay, so
while that's not a lengthy body there of this, there's a lot being said there. There's a lot to address.
I think there's a lot being said there, and I think to most, I mean, if you turn back the clock 15 years ago, I might read that and go, well, what's so unreasonable about that?
Right.
I mean, it doesn't sound crazy unreasonable. I mean, on the surface, right? So with that in mind, let's go through it point by point so, we get an idea of, I guess, maybe what my objections are. And it's not the fact that I object to it. So what? Who cares what I think? What I'm making the case for is that, his objections to anarchy, or preferably I'd call it the freedom philosophy, are unfounded and misguided, is basically what I'm going to say here. If you want to hear the details, listen, the first statement he makes is a right is something that must be provided. And I'm saying, no, a right actually is not something that is provided in the sense that people think like goods and services are properly provided by the free market. Those things are provided to you, right? You either purchase them or you don't, or you trade for them or you don't. But a right is not a good like that. A right is something that is inherently yours, right? The only right that you have, by the way, which again predates the state, in other words, you have it before, even if the state didn't exist, you would have this right, is your right to property. And we talked about this on the show many times, and I'll get into further detail on additional points. But it's not something that needs to be provided. It's something you already have. That's, I guess, as simple as I can get to basically arguing with his notion that a right is something that must be provided.
We do talk a lot on this show about personal property and personal rights.
Right.
So is that conflictive of that, Tom? Personal rights, or is that going along with what you're saying?
Yeah, I would argue, because people use personal rights, human rights. I mean, I can't think of all the terms that people have used, and I'm not entirely sure what people mean by those terms. So I always just call private property rights. I mean, in the vein of how Murray Rothbard defined them, and probably someone defined them before Murray Rothbard. So if I'm miscrediting there, where basically, and again, I don't want to go into a whole lot of details, that those rights are rooted in self-ownership. And we've talked about that in detail on the show numerous times.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean, that's the entirety of your rights, essentially. And it means a lot. And people say, well, I have the right to free speech. I have the right to health care. And I would argue they're not proper rights. And we can argue those. And we will argue that a little bit in the upcoming looking at the statements. But I'd like to move along because we'll get to that, is my point.
Go for it.
In his next sentence, Mr. Peterson states that any society aimed at protecting natural rights must use some type of force to guarantee those rights. Now, even sort of kind of someone who's a bit of a Again, I don't like to use he fancies himself as a libertarian or something. You hear natural rights and go, yeah, this dude, right on, natural rights. I'm all about it. I know about natural rights. I heard about it. So he uses some of the rhetoric, but think about what he's saying. Any society aimed at protecting natural rights must use some type of force to guarantee those rights. I'd argue, well, society doesn't have to protect your natural rights. I would say the burden is on you to protect your natural rights, right? That's first and foremost. So society has no obligation to me. The only thing is if somebody violates my property right, they would be, if I can convince an impartial third party that in fact happened, those people would be subject to sanction. In other words, a simple case, which we've done on this, if you stole my chickens and I was able to show an impartial third party that in fact that happened and you had your say too, right? That's how the whole proceedings went. And the impartial third party said, yep, Brad stole Tom's chickens. Well, then in my suit, I would want compensation. In other words, I likely, just because it's simple, I want my chickens back, and I want a little extra because of my time, my trouble. And by the way, since you lost, you have to pay for the court proceedings because you caused the whole thing. Right? That's the very simple version of it. And you say, well, life's more complicated. Yeah, I don't want to do hypothetical, very difficult, complex cases. They'd be worked out. But my basic rebuttal is, what he says, any society aimed at protecting natural rights must use some type of force to guarantee those rights. And my real question is, why do you assume that necessarily a society would have to use force to guarantee those rights? I would argue in a state of anarchy, there would be no state, of course. There'd be no mechanism to systematically initiate violence. A free society would allow me, for example, to accuse another of violating my rights. Just my chicken example. I could potentially represent myself, right? Essentially at the cost of my time and my labor, right? It's not no cost. Or I could hire somebody else to represent me in the proceedings in front of an impartial third party to hear my accusations formally, right? If I did not have the funds to do so, I could potentially borrow the money, right? I assume there'd be essentially something like a loan shark. A jury, a judicial proceeding shark. We'll advance you the money, but we want to get, a 20% repayment within 30 days, a premium on the payment, a 20% premium. So you got to pay us 120% of the money back. You might be able to secure a loan, right? In other words, I have a house, I have assets. Can I get a mortgage on that house and use that money because I'm so sure I'm going to win in this lawsuit? I could sell some of my property to raise the necessary funds. Or I could have been part of in other words, I could have had some insurance. We commonly call it a dispute resolution organization or a DRO, right? I could have bought that in advance, so I'm protected from this. So I could potentially have professionals handle this for me. I could belong to some kind of legal defense fund, just like exists today. You can donate to the Environmental Defense Fund, and when you have trouble with the environment, whatever, you contact them and say, hey, basically I'm a donator. Is this the kind of case that you guys might be interested in defending someone to bring this issue to light and to make the court case go the way that you believe it properly would? Right? My point is there's a zillion options of doing this. It's not just the fact that you say, even if I have no money and if I have no assets to do anything, I could go to somebody, and it'll probably be at a much higher rate, and say, hey, but I do have future earning potential. I'll let you take some of that because I'm so sure I can win this case, right? There's a number of other options. There's other things called just straight out charity. My brother might be willing to fund it for me. I might solicit people on the street and say, hey, would you be willing to help me fight this big bad corporation that wronged me, right? Or would you be willing to fight Brad with me because he stole my chickens? My point is, where's the necessity to use force against someone, right? It's not a fact that there has to be the initiation of violence to counteract the initiation of violence, right? And in fact...
Let me stop you there for a second, Tom, because what you just outlined isn't that part of what you just said? Doesn't that play to his point? Is the government not there to take care of the weak? Are these membership in the DRO some of these other things like that, are those not something for the privileged and not for the poor?
Yeah, that's a common argument. That's saying, well, like basically saying the free market only works for people who have cash, right? And I would argue to a large degree that's true. If you have no earning potential, you have no assets, you have absolutely nothing. Yeah, the free market does not do much for you other than, right? Would you rather be considered a poor guy in the place where they have the highest standard of living, or would you rather be a poor guy in a place where they have the lowest standard of living? In other words, I'm telling you, a poor guy in a rich country is way richer than a poor guy in a poor country, right? If I'm in the States and I'm a poor guy, I don't know, do I not have air conditioning and, I don't know, I think I have satellite TV, right? You have that. I have a refrigerator. I have all these things that if I was a poor guy in a poor country, I wouldn't even dream of having that stuff. Right? And people will argue with me and say, well, the only reason they have that stuff is because the government provides it for them. And I'm saying, the government doesn't provide them anything that they haven't taken from someone else first. So among the many things is that's the initiation of violence, which he claims to be against, right? He's saying, let's use the initiation of violence to get the resources to defend people from the initiation of violence. It seems like a contradiction to me. I believe it's very apparent. I can't lay it out any simpler than that. And again, there'd be all these other alternatives, and people are a lot smarter than me. I don't know what I listed, 6, 8 alternatives. There's probably 800 alternatives. I just can't think of them all, right? And again, I'm not the shell answer man. I'm just saying a society without institutionalized use of the initiation of violence, it sounds better to me than one that has violence institutionalized. and not that it sounds better to me. It's consistent with property rights is really the point. So I don't know if I fully address. I mean, you can get pretty deep in this pretty fast if you want to.
Yep, and I think we are.
Okay. The next sentence he says, I actually, if you accept my argument or if you ponder it closely, and maybe I don't know if I should say accept. Think about it. Digest it for a while. If you get there, though, the next sentence that he says in the argument is no longer in effect. He says, any mechanism of force used to guarantee those rights have the same effect as government, no matter what that form may take. I believe that's totally incorrect. You stole my chickens, so I go to an impartial third court and say, make the formal accusation, Brad stole my chickens. How am I initiating violence against anybody by making that accusation? Right? I'm not initiating violence. And you say, well, wait a minute. Brad says, hey, I didn't steal his stinking chickens. I'm not going to the impartial third court. That's actually a possibility in a free society. You can say, I ain't doing it. I have no part of this. It's frivolous. But here's the problem with you doing that. And I'm saying, again, you have the option to do it. But I think there's some downside to you. You can't clear your name, right? I think if you clearly didn't do it and the loser would pay the cost of the court, it wouldn't cost you anything because you could get compensated for your time involved because you might go, crap, I got to go there, I got to do this stuff. Well, you wouldn't do it unless you'd be compensated in the event you win, right? If you're so sure you're going to win, you'd be much more likely to do it. And you formally clear your name. Right? So we say, yeah, I heard that, 3 months back, Tom accused you of stealing the chickens. And you say, yeah, you didn't hear the court case. I was formally clear to that because I knew it was bogus from the start. And not only did Tom have to compensate me, he soiled his own name in the process. So if I was you, I wouldn't deal with Tom because he wrongly accuses people of stealing his chickens. Right? So I would say you would have the incentive to go. Again, you would have the option not to because, again, there would be no mechanism of forcing you to do it. So there is no initiation of violence that he claims would have to exist in this society. So I don't know what he's talking about unless he defines freedom completely different than what I understand it to be. And I'm basically, just so everybody knows, I'm basically Rothbardian, right, in that tradition. And if you don't know Rothbard, you got to read Rothbard. Otherwise, I can't explain everything that Rothbard has established in 3 seconds. So I think he's just simply inaccurate. And I don't see that what he says makes any sense. His next statement is, if there is a natural right to a lawyer, if you are accused of a crime, then that right means that there must be resources expended to provide citizens with a defense against the government's accusations. Now, first of all, I would just straight out say there is no natural right to a lawyer. I mean, we've talked about natural rights on this show many times, and I don't recall us ever saying, yeah, and the natural right to an attorney. I mean, it seems absurd. Now, maybe he's heard that from somebody somewhere and says, yeah, we have natural rights to lawyers. But think about this for a second. Let's assume he's correct. There is a natural right to a lawyer. Why? Because it's so essential, right? Well, if it's essential, if that's the criteria for having a natural right to something, I'm thinking like food, clothing, shelter, healthcare. Well, those are clearly natural rights then by, being consistent with his argument, which means somebody else has to provide that to me. Just like if I have a natural right to a lawyer, well, then some lawyers have to do the job I want them to do. And if that's the case, don't you call that at least a reduced form of slavery where somebody has to do what I want them to do? Isn't that the very definition of slavery? So in other words, his argument is saying that I can't be an anarchist because there has to be the initiation of violence. He's saying we need to have basically some form of slavery in order for us to be free. Again, I find that contradictory. Everybody has to make up their own mind. And you say, well, wait. If go with them. There's a natural right to lawyers. I mean, they could be paid. So there's no slavery here, Tom. You're missing the point. And I'm saying, wait a minute. Even if the attorney has to perform the service, and in fact, let's say he's compensated, where does this compensation come from? Well, those resources have to be confiscated from somebody else, someone who produced some wealth. It has to be taken from them to use to the attorney. So again, he's supporting the initiation of violence in order to oppose the initiation of violence. Again, I find it contradictory. And then even really, why stop there? If there's in fact no right to a lawyer, I would argue, then there's no right to health care. There's no right to a car. There's no right to a banana, right? Because there isn't. You just have property rights. Again, think about it. Property rights is simpler. It obligates no one else to anything. A true right doesn't obligate anyone to anything. The stuff he makes up, calling it a natural right to a lawyer, obligates someone to be a lawyer. Right? What if everyone in the world just said, yeah, I don't want to be a lawyer, but I have a natural right to a lawyer, so somebody's going to have to be forced to be a lawyer. Right? Again, it makes no sense what he's saying. It doesn't follow. It's incoherent. It's inconsistent. He says a fully privatized law system would be justice for sale to the highest bidder. Well, I would argue that clearly that's not the case. It's not justice for sale. Think about this. If it's a private law society, this is now a private court. This is a private firm, right? You think because Brad has more cash than me, and again, by the way, the third party that we go in front of, it has to be mutually agreeable. Again, right? Because I can't force Brad to come, again, back to my accusation of chickens. I can't force you to come to the court of my choosing. You might say, hey, I'm all interested in clearing my name. I'm all interested in clearing this up. But I'm not going to that court. Would you agree to this other court? And I might say, no, I don't agree to that court. Well, we have to agree on a court to go to a court. We simply have to. And if we don't, this doesn't get cleared up, right? I don't get compensation for my chickens, and you don't get your name cleared. And we may leave it at that. That's a possibility. I don't really see that's in our interests. It doesn't serve us well, so I'm assuming in a large volume of the cases that would be avoided, right? You want to clear your name, and I want to get compensated for my stinking chickens. So I assume at some point, reasonably, we're going to be able to agree on a court, and largely that would go away very quickly. It's a long story, and I don't want to get into it, but I don't even see that really as an issue. And I know some people want to make that an issue, but again, that's another show. But I'll argue this for the sake of this article. The perceived best representation would be, in fact, for sale for the highest bidder. I wouldn't argue that, right? Bill Gates. I got cash like you can't fathom. Well, sure. I would try, if this is even remotely serious, I'd try to hire the attorneys that were the biggest guns and they were the best, the brightest. They went to the best schools. I don't know, however you define best, right? And I'm going to assume they go and charge a whole lot of cash. But I got boatloads, so it doesn't matter to me. And you're poor, so you can't hire the same level of big, the O.J. Simpson case, right? He hired the muckety-muck guys, and then the rest were public defenders, essentially, that were on the prosecution side. And go ahead.
David versus Goliath.
David versus Goliath. Let's just say that plays out. Why would it be in the interest of this private law firm to go, all right, here's the deal. We're going to hear this case, but kind of no matter what is said in there, we're going to go with Bill Gates. He's got the cash, right? Long term, they risk a whole lot more than this settlement. Yeah, they can make Mr. Gates happy, but what about their reputation now gets ruined going forward? Right? What if there is, I can prove that there's payola going on, or actually you would, in this piss poor example I'm doing, you could prove that, hey, they just bowed to Tom Gates, the man with all the cash, and they did not rule and act consistent with the principles of liberty, right? If you can show that, now the court has liability there. Not only liability, they can, again, just like we could lose their reputation, just like you could lose your reputation, right? That means they could lose customers. They could lose the asset value of their company over this. And they would be less inclined to do such a thing versus the very system we have today, right? What I'm saying is, am I saying the world would be perfect if we got rid of the state and everybody abided by their natural rights? I'm not saying it would be perfect. Why? Because everybody wouldn't abide by them. There's actual real criminals out there. But I'm saying we would be much closer to a just society. It would be a quote-unquote better society, depending on how you define it. Right? People argue, well, we can't do this because you can't show me that the world will be perfect. And I'm like, well, first of all, that's a very tall order. I would argue that's unreasonable. And second of all, there is no perfection in this world. But we could make things better. Why would people oppose that? And I would argue largely because they don't understand what we're talking about here, and which is why we're talking about it. Right? So there would be recourse against this private law firm that would be far larger than what, scraps that Tom Gates would be able to hand them. So their likelihood of bending to me, because I got all the cash, would be less than what exists today, which everybody says, oh, the courts are rigged, they're in their back pocket of the muckety-mucks. And they are. I'm saying, why not move to a situation where they'd be less likely to do so? People say, no, because you can't show me it's perfect. So, anyway, they'd have liability concerns. They would be less likely to act not in concert with the legal principles, right? The judge doesn't want to generate any liability. He wants to work for a reputable firm because I assume you're a judge because you believe you're a reputable guy. If your firm does crappy stuff with another judge, you may want to get out of that company saying, I don't want to be in that law dispute resolution firm because they're slowly going to get a bad reputation because that other judge I work with. Right? I'm going to move on because I'll get too deep. The next sentence states, citizens without the means to defend themselves could be railroaded into arbitration that works against their interest and for whoever paid for the judge. Here's the deal. I'm not sure what he means by arbitration in a free society. Arbitration is a means of dispute resolution. Okay? I don't really have a problem with dispute resolution. That's the aim of these proceedings, is to resolve our disputes. Okay? I kind of like that. I mean, currently arbitration is known as a maybe less formal and therefore less costly version of a court trial, which is appropriate for some things. Right? So arbitration, I would argue, is a good thing in this society. Now, would those things be defined the same in a free society? I don't know. I don't know how people would define things, but just for sake of argument, say they likely would. There's no problem with arbitration. You wouldn't be forced into going to arbitration. How would you be railroaded? Again, if you had a really strong case and I got no money, I go to an attorney who maybe I'm smart enough to go to an attorney who specializes in this area of law. And I go, hey, Charlie, check it out. I got all the basic facts in my case on my side. I'm not an attorney, so I can't tell you, but you look at it and you tell me. And Charlie goes, dang, I'm thinking I could win this for you. Good. Will you take this, what's like on a contingent basis? Would you do this? If you're so sure that you can represent me well and we can win, then of course the loser pays. Theoretically, you win, the other side's the loser. They're going to pay all this stuff. That attorney might go, yeah, for a number of reasons. He might be willing to take a relatively low rate of pay. He might be willing to accept the risk. He may want to enhance his reputation by having a win in his repertoire, right? I don't know there's a zillion possible reasons why a guy might do that. And again, if you go to one and he says, nope, I ain't doing that, you could always go to another. And that's, again, if you have no resources. If you have some resources, you got more alternatives.
Commonly called pro bono.
Yeah. I mean, he could do it totally, hey, I'll do it free of charge because I want to get a gold star next to my name, and this is my opportunity. Right?
Not going to happen. Not going to happen every time.
No.
Right.
But again, this is a case where a guy has absolutely no resources. That's one of many possibilities. And again, I'm a dumb guy. There might be 1,000 possibilities. I just don't know them off the top of my head. So I don't see how people would be railroaded. Again, if loser pays and I'm so certain that you stole my chickens, even if I don't have resources, I think I can either represent myself if it's a slam dunk deal. I'm so certain that makes it a slam dunk in my mind. And if not, I might be able to arrange something either with getting a loan or all those other alternatives that we already talked about. So again, I don't see this. And even if somebody did get railroaded, just say it happened. I would argue it would happen way less in that type of arrangement than the current arrangement. So I think even in the very worst case, it's a very weak argument at best. Right? I'm going to move on. He says, the next sentence, he says, for that reason, the Constitution laid out the means for citizens to be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures, cruel or unusual punishments, or from things like double jeopardy. Well, this is a little different than being railroaded, so I think he's moved on in topic. But because it's a private law society, why do you think people were going to be unreasonably searched? If it's a private, call it a quote-unquote police firm, and they go to your house looking for the chickens, and let's just say for a moment you're completely innocent. You don't have any, you've never raised chickens, you don't have chickens, and they went, now they're subject to recourse, right? From you. You go, hey, you dudes searched my house and you didn't have a probable cause. You didn't have, a viable reason for doing this. And now I'm going to sue you, right? So the likelihood of an illegal search and seizure would be reduced in that society because they could get pinched. Today, if the cops go in and, how many times have we heard about these stories where they want to go on a drug raid or something? They go into the wrong house and even somebody gets killed in that raid. The bottom line is, oops, sorry. There's no recourse against the cops, against the judge who issued the warrant, right? It's just, that's the way it is. I'm saying a society that would have recourse against those actions would be less likely to engage in them, not more likely. So again, I don't think his logic follows. And again, people quote, put your comments on our Facebook page. Tell me where I'm going wrong on this. Tell me where I don't make any sense. I mean, I'd love to engage in the discussion, but I simply don't see this line to line. Again, the idea of recourse in a private law society is huge, where you don't have that today. So again, I would argue, okay, is it a perfect world? There's no such thing to my knowledge, but is it a vast improvement over what we have today? Absolutely. So why is everybody so, if you propose such things, people just freak out. I don't see, I tend to like better.
It's pretty hard to argue that we have a perfect world today, for sure.
Right. And all I'm saying is that, a society that, again, words I don't like, is based in what Walter Block calls libertarian theory, provides for a better world. He never says it's for a perfect world, right? And that's, I get dragged down in that argument with people lots of times. Well, that's not perfect. Well, I never said it was perfect. I don't know if anybody knows perfect. I mean, call me up. Let me know. I'd be interested in finding out if you do know. Again, so it's the idea of recourse against these guys. This is why I would argue unreasonable searches and seizures, cruel or unusual punishments, and things like double jeopardy would happen way less frequently than they do today. So I don't understand the objection is really my point. Whether I agree with them or not, who cares? Again, I don't even understand the objection. I think it's wholly inconsistent to make that accusation. I think there's just a few more sentences. He says, in the next one, he says, it means that while citizens have the right to defend themselves, they must also be defended if they are too weak to defend themselves. Again, we talked about possibilities of how people could do it if they have little or no resources. But I think what he's alluding to is citizens have the right to defend themselves. They must also be defended. The word is must. They must be defended. Well, how are you going to get resources? Right? I'm arguing if people must be defended, that means somehow they have to be supplied with resources. How are you going to get those resources? Right? And you say, well, voluntarily means maybe we'll just ask them. That's what I'm proposing. That's what a free society is. Right? But I believe, and again, I'm putting this in there, when he says they must, I assume he means there has to be an organization like the state that confiscates wealth from people who create it to supply it to people who don't create the wealth. Well, that's the very definition of stealing, of legalized theft. Again, and I would call the legalized theft or stealing falls under the category of initiating violence against someone. So his remedy for the problem of someone that had violence initiated against them is to initiate violence against others to defend this guy. Again, a wholly inconsistent argument. Again, one thing I didn't mention, but, today we have this organization called the ACLU, and there's probably others that I'm not familiar with. But there's no reason that those types of organization couldn't exist in a free society. There might be an ACLU in a free society. So, might go, hey, ACLU, I got no resources, but check out what happened to me. And they might go, we're interested in getting involved in that. Or we're not, but we might know somebody who is. Right? And then all the other things that we talked about, that people, you might solicit donations, you might work on charity, ask for charitable contributions, blah, blah, blah. All those other means we already talked about. He talks about members of the Arizona militia don't worry about home invasions, but 90-year-old grandmothers in Massachusetts might. One of the statistics, and I'm not relying this as a source of my argument, but basically older people in this life typically have more resources than younger people. Why? In part, they worked their whole life. They have accumulated assets, right? But that's totally besides the point. But I just thought that was an interesting side. Again, but I'd argue there would be a number of means available to providing security services, right? And we already asked them, so why do you... And maybe there's a 90-year-old grandmother who says, I don't want any security services at all. I'm doing it myself. I don't even want to use a gun. I got my... I don't know what she has. My knitting needle. That's how I'm going to fend off my enemies. Knitting needle. If they come in here, they're going to get one in the eye. There's nothing wrong with that. She could choose to do that. Again, if people didn't have their wealth institutionally stolen from them, they might have greater amounts of wealth. So it might be my 90-year-old grandmother, and I'm like, dang, she really should have protection services, but she doesn't have any money. So since I would likely be in a higher standard of living, I'd even be more likely to help my grandmother. Well, again, you can't do that because so much of your income and your wealth has been confiscated already. One of the interesting sides that people say, they always, even the president, this one and others in any disaster, when there's all kinds of disaster relief charities that are created, They ask for donations. A lot of the politicians say, we constantly marvel at how much donation there is, how the American people pull together and they help one another. Well, they do this after their taxation, right? After their wealth, a certain percentage of their wealth has been confiscated. So imagine how much they might be willing to donate if they didn't have a big chunk of their wealth confiscated, right? And again, when I mention this to people about a free state, well, you're saying you're just relying on that. Well, there's other means too. I'm just saying this is one possibility, and I believe people would be more apt to help others in such a society.
And I think that's a big one that is really hard for people to fathom. That if I wasn't encumbered by all the requirements of taxation, my favorite thing to talk about is that, did you help me understand is, what if I at the end of the year had a la carte menu on programs I wanted to support and that I had no interest in?
Yes. I think that was maybe I getting to some of that in my next argument here. I can't remember where I was, but yeah, I mean, imagine in a free society, I assume you wouldn't buy stuff that you don't want. I mean, maybe some people would. I don't know what goes into people's thinking.
Right. Maybe I don't want to support a wind farm in, off the coast of Connecticut.
Right.
Or whatever. I don't know.
Maybe I don't.
Maybe I really do.
Right.
Want to support that wind farm.
So send them your cash.
Right.
Maybe I don't want to pay for some young American guys going over to a foreign land and engaging in a war.
Maybe I don't want to pay for a state-funded abortion clinic. Maybe I really want to pay for a state-funded abortion clinic.
Right. So you're right. There's no thing to stop you. There would be no thing to stop you from not paying.
Right. But I wouldn't be required. Exactly.
Right. And that freaks people out. You mean you're not required to pay into something that I might want to use. Right? You're not required to put money in a pot so that I could get an attorney for free. Right? And they feel like, oh, my safety net is gone. But think about it. I think you would have a larger safety net. It just wouldn't be based on coercion. It wouldn't be based on forcing Brad to put money into a pot. It would actually be meaningful help if I went to Brad and asked him, Brad, would you be willing to kick in a few bucks to help me out in this situation? If you did, you'd do it out of your own free will, which means a lot more to me, or would to me anyway. I can't tell you how anyone else would react, than if you were forced to put it in that pot. I mean, how many times has someone who's on, and it is bad because I don't even know the program's rule. I'm on food stamps. I'm in line and you're right behind me and you're not on food stamps, right? And you see, and it's actually not stamps anymore, right? It's like a credit card thing, I think.
Yeah.
And you standing behind me, you see me use that and you're thinking, hey, I paid at least in part for that. How many times do people turn around and go, are you paying cash or using food stamps, sir? And you say, well, no, I got to pay for my own groceries. Do people turn you and go, by the way, thank you, Brad, because I'm able to get food because that wealth was taken from you, and I appreciate it. How many times does that happen?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be very uncomfortable with that because I think that we would probably accuse us of sounding like privileged or that we're knocking those folks that are in that situation, and we all know that people can get in that situation.
Hey, and my audience doesn't know that I'm not in that situation.
And that's a fact.
Right?
But so let's turn it another way, back to the public defense. Probably, I don't know if this to be a fact or not, but the Boston bomber.
Yes.
I don't know if he had a public defendant or not.
I don't know if he did. I think he did, but I'm not positive.
Okay,
Tim might know.
Yep, I don't know. But let's, I don't. He's one, and everybody's innocent until proven guilty. You would argue that in our current system, but let's say that that's the supposition. Did you, from afar? I think a lot of people would say, well, those guys are guilty. Heck, they've even said, yeah, we did this. So, How do you feel about your money going towards, defending that guy?
I don't feel good about it being forcibly taken from me, no matter what that money's used for.
Yep.
Right? Even if it's something I like, I still don't like it forcibly taken from me. If I like it, I'll just buy it.
Yep.
Right? If I want it, why can't I just buy it? I mean, that's essentially, people use the analogy, well, you're voting with your money, right? You're telling what services you want, what you may want more of by buying them, which services you approve of. And the ones I don't buy are ones either I could possibly be unaware of, but I might not like them. I don't approve of them. Right? So I don't buy them. It's essentially, it's a way of, quote unquote, voting with your dollars. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Rather than being told how to vote.
Yes. This is how your dollars, we're going to take them from you, and this is how we're going to use them. Well, I object to that. I don't get that. Anyway, the bottom line is the aim of a free society would, in fact, be justice. Mr. Peterson states that if the aim of a society is to protect life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, I believe a free society would offer the best possible case. Why? It's because it eliminates, as Hans Hermann Hoppe describes, the expropriating property protector. It's really something I alluded to earlier. You can't fight the case that, hey, violence was initiated against me. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have this other mechanism called the state initiate violence against everyone, take some of their money so I can defend myself. Again, it doesn't follow. And that's what the whole idea of the state, Hoppe says, it's an expropriating property protector. In other words, they tax you, they confiscate your wealth in order to protect your property. Well, what do you think? They violate your property right in order to protect your property. It's a contradiction. It's an inherent contradiction. It makes no sense. And that arguably right there is essentially my case against the state. It does exactly what it claims it's to protect you from. It makes no sense. And then I'll go with his very last statement, and because we're right here to wrap it up. It says, a virtuous society would also hopefully include the unborn in that definition. I would argue that statement is essentially completely unrelated to a real argument. I realize he put it in there, so it's part of his argument, but it doesn't make any sense for that statement to even be there. Why? Because I'll kind of allude to Walter Block. A libertarian theory of justice has nothing further to add to essentially the abortion issue. That's what I think he's alluding to when he's called the unborn, right? The basic argument now is, well, when does life begin? If it begins at week 7 at 3:00, anything before 3:00 is not killing an unborn life, so it's not killing. So it's not a violation of property rights. Anything after 3:00 on that day, we consider it life. So now you can't terminate that life because that's killing, because it's a property right violation. But my point is, libertarian theory has nothing to add to that. I don't know when life begins. Who knows? I know everybody claims they do, or a lot of people do. I don't know. So, if I had a fetus in me, I'd make my own judgment, but I don't think I should have the legal authority to enforce my decision on you or a woman or anybody else, right? And that's what that is largely about. Again, what I'm saying is his statement there is unrelated to a system of justice. Well, I don't know what to say to that other than I don't get the relationship to an argument that would be a case against freedom. All right. And I would go further than that, and you say, well, that's kind of odd. This libertarian theory of justice has nothing to say about that. Well, let me tell you, the libertarian theory of justice has nothing to say about the definition of gravity or electromagnetism or about turnips. Is that a problem for people? I think most of them go, well, no, that's totally unrelated. That's what I'm saying. Right? So the things that people have objections to, I mean, you got to think about this logically, and you can only deduce it from the first two things, right? The non-aggression principle, which means essentially you're subject to sanction if you initiate violence against someone. And the other thing is, well, how do we know if we initiated violence against you? Well, you'd have to establish property rights. And again, I believe the only way that you can coherently establish property rights is through self-ownership. And again, we've done shows about that to define that for people who haven't heard them. That's new. Keep listening to the shows that are upcoming. You'll get it. Or go read on your own. So that was his last statement. So let me just wrap up here so people kind of get the gist of my argument. I'm saying Mr. Peterson's objection to a libertarian theory of justice does not properly address libertarian theory. In other words, I got a problem with your system of justice because trains are painted yellow. It's like, I don't follow you. I think trains being painted yellow have nothing to do with a libertarian theory of justice, so I don't get what your problem is. A theory of justice does not properly provide anything to anyone. It merely states essentially the rules of the game, right? I don't understand what's wrong with having rules. And then you say, well, if you have rules, shit has to be provided to you. It doesn't make any sense. And he also says, I'd argue wrongly states that a libertarian theory of justice must initiate violence. I think I fully refuted that. There's no necessity to initiate violence. Again, an anarchistic society, to use his words, would essentially outlaw the initiation of violence. So it couldn't use the initiation of violence to repel the initiation of violence. That would be by definition defensive force. That's a whole nother ballgame. And I would argue further, he seems to object to the use of voluntary exchange for presumably vital services. Right? So he's saying, because he says we have to basically confiscate wealth from other people so that the people who can't defend themselves can defend themselves. I mean, my question is really, what's your problem with the free market? What's wrong with people freely associating? What's wrong with them cooperating voluntarily? You know, and if that's the case, if you have a problem with the free market or voluntary exchange, why don't you advocate for the provision of other vital services, food, water, and shelter? Right? They seem pretty vital to me. If you're saying an attorney is vital, I don't know if an attorney is as vital as food, water, and shelter, because if my court case ain't tomorrow, I got to eat today. That seems like a more immediate problem. You know, so I'm saying if that's the case, he actually supports the initiation of violence, right? He's saying we have to take wealth from you so people who don't have wealth can defend themselves. In other words, he's saying what I have a problem with in a free society, I want to use as a tool. Again, a complete contradiction and incoherent argument. Unless this guy's really keen and he's got some kind of magic box that makes the wealth. Or, wait a minute, he could be a Star Trek fan and he's got the replicator that's found on the Starship Enterprise. Okay? Those are the only two cases that I think he could not be contradicting. He's like, I got the magic box. I can make as much wealth as he want. Well, then he might have solved some problems.
Let's all find one of those boxes.
Yeah. I got to get a hold of this fella and ask him. Because if he's got it, I'd be willing to pay a handsome sum for that. Which would be stupid, because if he's got a replicator, why wouldn't he just replicate money? He wouldn't need mine.
And I know it's off the subject, but I think I've heard, I don't know, 2 or 3 times in the last couple of days, either it's a federal and a state, I think it's both, discussions about raising the federal and state minimum wage.
Yes.
And I love what you say about that. I'm not gonna steal your thunder, but go ahead and say it.
I don't know. I don't really know where to start. That's a long one.
Well, but if that made so much sense,
exactly. I mean, the simple one of the simple points is if it made so much sense to raise it to $15 an hour because then those people will be well off. Well, how stupid are we? Why don't we just raise it to $100,000 a second so everybody's will be stinking rich?
Right.
I mean, why would we stop at making you know, okay, you can make it okay? Why don't we just make everybody stinking rich? In other words, what's so special about 15? Why not 16? Why not 1501? Why we're at why not $1 million an hour, right? Why stop at 15?
Okay, well, that took us off the subject. Sorry.
So I want to say debate over libertarian theory is seen by some as infighting and productive. Here's kind of maybe one of my broader statements, right? If I I don't know, this guy, I don't know, maybe he's a minarchist. I don't know what he is. So people are going to say, well, I'm picking on this guy, right? I'm nitpicking his argument together. And am I on some kind of ego trip, right? Or why am I doing this? And I'm saying there's a real purpose. And again, this is a Walter Block thing. He doesn't see it that way. When you enter in, like Brad calls it, respectful, serious debate, which, I mean, I don't intend to put the guy down as, I don't use any of the characterizations. I just basically argued with what he wrote.
Naturally, we'd welcome him to join us to debate this.
Absolutely. That would be awesome. But, what this does is some people may see it as infighting and, I don't know, egotistical or however you want to describe it. I see it as, we're trying to get at the true nature of man. In other words, short version, the truth. And the more we debate about it and the more we discuss about it and think about it, I think the better chance we are to get there. So that's what this whole thing is about, at least for me. And again, you may see this differently, but that's how I see it. And I think it's healthy. I think it's a good thing when done respectfully, right? And essentially calmly. So, I look forward to bringing you our analysis of the remainder of Mr. Peterson's objections in the upcoming shows. And I think it's worthwhile. But again, use Facebook to let us know if you thought we brought something to the table, if you think we shouldn't continue with this, or whatever your comments are. We're open to them. We'd like to hear them.
Right.
So with that, I think I'm done with objection number 1 from Austin Peterson.
All right. Well, we will be on next week on May 26th at 7 p.m. Central Time, as always, with our good friend, the Northwoods Mom. We appreciate you joining us by all means. And we appreciate you tuning in. We would love to hear your comments. Please share with your friends about us. As Tom always says, share with your enemies if you really hate them. But we hope that we, as always, have provoked you to think. Share with us your comments. Join in this discussion. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to our next discussion with you. Until next time, say goodnight, Tom.
Good night, everybody. We're leaving you with Mac DeMarco. Goodbye weekend. Thanks for the discussion. And again, like as Brad said, till next time, we're going to have another one with, don't worry, Northwoods Mom will be here. It'll be better. We'll talk to you then. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Annoying Peasant Radio Show.